that between AD 650 and 1900, 10 million to 20 million people were enslaved by Arab slave traders. Others believe that over 20 million enslaved Africans alone had been delivered through the trans-Saharan route alone to the Islamic world. Dr. John Alambella Azuma estimates in his 2001 book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, that over 80 million more black people died over that route. The Arab slave trade was so intense, bloody, merciless to say the least. The cruelty on African captives by the Arabs was beyond telling. Similar to the transatlantic slave trade, captured slaves were beaten to be weakened and chained together. However, captured victims in the sub-Saharan slave trade had to endure several weeks of walking through the desert, carrying loads for their new masters from West or East Africa, to where they were eventually sold in the slave markets: Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other centers. These slaves played various roles in the economy of the Muslim world. They were used as servants, harem keepers, laborers in fields, mines, and hydraulic yards, and as cannon fodder in armies. In several of his detailed books about the slave trade, British explorer Henry Hamilton Johnston explains how several slaves died in the desert, while others who fell sick or were badly bruised and could not make it were brutally killed by their masters. David Livingstone, the British missionary, traveler, and explorer, was so upset by the way the Arabs treated their African slaves that he wrote back home in the year 1870. These were his words: "In less than I take to talk about it, these unfortunate creatures, 84 of them, wended their way into the village where we were. Some of them, the eldest, were women from 20 to 22 years of age, and there were youths from 18 to 19 years. But the large majority was made up of boys and girls from 7 years to 14 or 15 years of age. A more terrible scene than these men, women, and children I do not think I ever came across. To say that they were emaciated would not give you an idea of what human beings can undergo under certain circumstances. Each of them had his neck in a large forked stick weighing from 30 to 40 pounds and 5 or 6 feet long, cut with a fork at the end of it where the branches of a tree spread out. The women were tethered with bark thongs, which are of all things the most cruel to be tied with. Of course, the bark thongs are soft and supple when first stripped off the trees, but a few hours in the sun would make them about as hard as the iron round packing cases. The little children were fastened by thongs to their mothers. As we passed along the path through which these slaves had traveled, I was shown a spot in the bushes where a poor woman the day before, unable to keep up with the march and most likely to hinder it, was cut down by the axe of one of these slave drivers. We went on further and were shown a place where a child lay. It had been recently born, and its mother was unable to carry it from debility and exhaustion. So the slave trader had taken this little infant by its feet and dashed its brains out against one of the trees and thrown it in there. Such was the brutality meted out to the Africans by the Arabs. Looking at all this in a very factly honest manner, the totality of the unthinkable, horrid practices besetted upon a certain group of people, historians agree that it is a mistake to equate the bare survival of Africa with cultural or social or economic stagnation, for the slave trade visited such panoply of tragically interconnected disasters into the lives of every African for centuries, so that they have worked their way into the very racial memory of the continent and its people, particularly females, that only with time and kindness can it be expunged from the psyche of Africa. The Arabs' treatment of black Africans can aptly be termed an African genocide. Arabs killed more Africans in transit, especially when crossing the Sahara Desert, than Europeans and Americans combined, and over more centuries, both before and after the years of the Atlantic slave trade. Arab Muslims began extracting millions of black African slaves centuries before Christian nations did. Arab slave traders removed slaves from Africa for about 13 centuries, compared to the 3 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. African slaves transported by Arabs across the Sahara Desert died more often than slaves making the middle passage to the New World by ship. Slaves invariably died within 5 years if they worked in the Ottoman Empire's Sahara salt mines. Black Africans did not enjoy immunity to many of the diseases found in the Arab world, which also resulted in high death rates. In West Africa, the Arab slave trade encompassed a vast region from the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea. This traffic followed the trans-Saharan roads. The crossing could last up to 3 months with a high mortality rate due to the dire conditions of the trip. Here is the testimony of the German explorer Gustav Nachtigal,